Good morning everyone, and thank you very much for joining me today as we go through this webinar where I'll have a look at 3 different texts for you to apply the rules for document design and tabulation that I went through in my video just that I put out yesterday on YouTube and on Facebook. So if you didn't get the chance to watch the video, we'll go through a lot of those rules and a lot of the explanations in that video, and we'll put them into practice so you can see why they're important, and more importantly how you can improve your writing, your texts, or even how you might understand someone else's writing or someone else's texts. But before I go into that, it would be great if someone could just say hello and that they could hear me, so I know that the microphone is working and that there are no problems from your end. And as always, I'll be looking left and right as I'm going through the webinar just to keep an eye on whether the webinar is healthy, connection problems and things like that. So if I'm looking left and right, don't think that I'm ignoring you. I'm not, just making sure that you can see and hopefully hear me. Okay, so let's get the show on the road. And let's have a look at our first example. Any claim by the customer against the company arising in respect of any service provided for the customer or which the company has undertaken to provide shall be made in writing and notified to the company within 14 days of the date upon which the customer became or should have become aware of any event or occurrence. Now, you'll probably have difficulty listening to me say all of those words, and we read in exactly the same way. So there's the first things to mention is that here we've got one sentence. There is no punctuation. There's no structure in that sentence which identifies any of the points which are being made. And there are lots of points being made. They're just crashing into one another, and there's no way that we can, at first glance or the first time that we read this, understand what those points are. So it's a classic case of over-particularization. In other words, communicating far too much information in one go. So when you try to communicate this, or if you try to hear it, the initial response is to go, whoa, hang on, break it down for me one bit at a time. But of course, because someone has written it in this way, then it becomes the job of the reader to then break it down bit by bit, and then you've got questions of, is the reader able to break this down bit by bit, and if the reader can, does the reader do it correctly? And we'll have a look at an example of the correctness or accuracy of how someone can break down a text a little bit later on with one of the other texts. So this is the immediate problem of bad document design. Not just lack of punctuation, not just long sentences, but bad document design. Because you can imagine that if someone wrote a sentence like this in a document, then the rest of that document would probably look something similar to this. So you generally, when you're writing, it's not that you write one area of your text with poor document design and then the other area of your text or document is wonderfully designed. Is generally that one person writes in a particular format or style, and that is the style for that document. So you can imagine this text which I've taken from a document, well, the rest of the document looks pretty much the same as this. In other words, it's a bit of a nightmare. But it's just amazing when we break this text down how many points and what points are being made. Because my correction, well, before we do that, let's see if we can identify some of these points, pull them out of the text. Now, I've got myself a new tool to play around with, so let's see if I can use this and see if it will work. So first of all, the main point is this: any claim by the customer against the company arising. Okay, so we've got a customer who's got complaints against the company or a claim against the company. Oh, hang on a second. I can see already that there might be a small problem. So let me just correct this. Because I can see on YouTube that the top of the screen is missing, so I'm just going to drag the screen down a little bit to make sure that you can see what I can see. I'm just waiting for the change to take place on YouTube. Aha, okay, you can. Okay, good. Okay. Problem over. So let's go back to that. So let's try and dig out the points again. See if we can. So first of all, there's a customer who might have a claim against the company. Why might that customer have a complaint against the company? Well, we've got this bit here. Let's change our color. Arising in respect of any service provided for the customer. Okay, so we've got the company might provide a service for the customer, and the customer might have a complaint about that. And then we've got or, which the company has undertaken to provide. So this is slightly different, but nevertheless it's another action towards the customer. So we've got two possible ways the customer might have a claim against the company. And then we've got a condition about how that claim might be made. So let's change our color again. I don't think we've got a great deal of choice. Hang on a second, let's go to this color here. And that this shall be made in writing, and that it must be notified to the company within 14 days upon the date So that's all of the second condition as well. So we've got a number of pieces of information here which are divided up in a number of different ways, because here if I choose and go back with this color here, we've got an and here. So here we've got an or, and up here we've got an and. So you can see there's plenty of information going on in this text. So the first question you would ask yourself is, how could you possibly expect to understand all of those points or be aware of all of those points just if you're given the information, the language presented as it is? So my correction to this document would look something like this. A customer's claim against the company about services provided for the customer or undertaken by the company shall be made in writing and sent to the company within 14 days of the date, etc, etc, etc. So if we break down the information in this way, and if you disagree with me, if you think if I've misunderstood this and I should have broken it down in a different way, then please get in contact with me, and I'm more than happy to have that discussion. Because remember, what we're doing here is we're trying to interpret texts. So it's very, very difficult to say what's a correct answer and what's a wrong answer, because the whole problem of interpretation is that people can interpret things in different ways. And now, of course, that goes back to the main point of writing, which is if you're writing a document, you don't want the document to be interpreted in different ways, which is why it's a bad idea to write, to create a great big block of text like this, because something like that, oh, we've gone off the screen there, something like that can be interpreted potentially in different ways. So what I've done here is I've broken down the first piece of information. So I've got an or here, so it's one of the other. So, and then we've got shall be, and then we've got a list which must involve both points, made in writing and be sent to the company within 14 days of the date, etc, etc, etc. So if we tabulate this list in this way, suddenly it becomes a lot clearer and it becomes a lot less open to interpretation. So I would always encourage you to tabulate any lists that you have in this way. And of course the use of white space, or in this case blue space, highlights exactly what the points are, where they are, and makes it a lot easier for people to find them in the future. The other thing about this this original text is, perhaps one good thing you can say about this is that there are plenty of verbs in this text. So there's plenty of action words. So the good thing is that what the person should do is not hidden. It's obviously expressed through using verbs. The problem is that there are so many verbs you don't know which one to focus on, which is another reason why tabulating a list allows a structure to be broken down in terms of verbs or options in an easy to understand way. So I can see here, okay, I've got this option, I've got this option, then I've got this option, and then I've got this option, and I've got this option. And if you break it down in terms of options, it makes life a lot easier to understand. Okay, let's move on to the next example. Now this is a bit of a nonsense example, I'll admit that straight away, but I just wanted to use this example to highlight one or two issues. The example reads like this: however, the implementation of the refinancing structure, that is, of the contribution by AA of BB's shares to CC, the selling of DD of EE's shares to FF, liquidation of GG, contribution of HH's shares by II to transform JJ into KK, will take approximately ... So there's a whole load of stuff going on here, and you can see that this is breaking down how the refinancing structure should be implemented. So something like this immediately lends itself, here we go, this is the how the refinancing structure should be implemented, or what the stages are. So when you know that you're going to cover a number of points, straight away you should be thinking tabulation and how the tabulation should work. Now, it could be the case that you need to express this in terms of order. So if you need to say what comes first, what comes second, etc., etc., then using a numbered list would be the way to go. So number 1 before number 2 before number 3, etc., etc. If order is not important, then just use a bulleted list or a different form of a non-numbered list to highlight that structure. I mentioned in the video that it's not such a great idea to use Roman numerals. This is something that is covered, or lots of law professors who teach legal writing say, or encourage people not to use Roman numerals. The idea is that sometimes people don't know how to read Roman numerals. But I'm pretty sure that most people have got a good understanding of how Roman numerals work. If you are not comfortable with the idea, then don't use them. But certainly in the past, when I've been working with lawyers and I've said, don't use Roman numerals, they've looked at me in a fairly strange way. And I know that is a battle which is incredibly difficult to win, so I tend not to fight that battle. But just to raise it as a word of warning, if you are writing a document for public consumption, so for the wider public as a whole, maybe it's a good idea to stay away from Roman numerals. Okay, getting back to this list, let's clear that away. I've broken this down in this way. The implementation of the refinancing structure, that is the contribution by AO of BB shares to CC, and so on, so on, so on. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but I'll show you what I've done. If you have a look at the original example, let's choose. What we've got here is clearly it's a list of some kind. It's going through a number of different points, but it's a question of how the list is created. If we've got, well, let's have a look at it. The first point is of the. The second point is the selling. then we've got liquidation, then we've got contribution, then we've got to transform JJ into KK. What we've got here is a number of different ways in which the points in our list are introduced. Now, grammatically, I think they all agree with the introductory sentence, which is the implementation of the refining structure, that is, id est, that is. And so after an introductory structure like that, most grammatical forms will work, and I think that's the case in this issue. So if we go back to magic L, G, which is a grammar, we can tick that box, it works. But in terms of C, which was class, or you might know it as parallel phrasing, the box is most definitely not ticked, because the whole idea of class or parallel phrasing is that all of the points, or as many of the points as possible, start in the same grammatical way. The advantages of this are quite clear, and the most obvious one is that it's easy to understand. If you have a number of points which start with a number of different grammatical structures, then it leads the reader, or rather it doesn't communicate your message very well, and it may jump from one thing to another thing. In the example that I gave in my video, which I put out yesterday, or Friday I think it was, I gave you an example of this where I think it was a simple tense form, then it was a future form, and then it was a perfect form. Perfect forms talk about completed activities in the past. And then we had a future simple form, which talks about an uncompleted activity in the future. And then there was a prepositional form as well. So in reading that list, the reader has got to perform mental gymnastics. They've got to go into the past, then they've got to go into the future, and then they've got to start thinking about something else outside of time. When that can throw the reader, that can confuse the reader. Here what we've got is a prepositional structure of the contribution. Here we've got a noun which is a gerund, and the gerund might suggest activity, might suggest something that's going on. And then we've got two abstract nouns, liquidation and contribution. And abstract nouns are things that are happening, but they're ideas, if you will. They're not real things, because you have abstract noun and concrete nouns. Concrete nouns are things that we can see and we can touch and we can feel. Abstract nouns are things that we can't. So it's impossible to touch liquidation. It's a process. So here we've got two abstract ideas, and then we've got an infinitive form at the end. So we're jumping around from how we introduce all of our points. What we've got here in my solution is uniformity or agreement between all of these points. So we've got the contribution, the sale, the liquidation, the I think I might have made a mistake. No, there's the contribution again, and then the transformation of JJ into KK. So we've got agreement amongst all of these points. Very easy to read, very easy to follow, and so on. So here the agreement focuses on the activity or the thing that's going on. Just a quick note on repetition, because this came up yesterday with someone I was working with. Don't be afraid of repetition from the point of view of clarity, or that someone will understand your legal writing. You will lose one or two small style points. Okay, not a problem. You can lose a few style points, but losing a few style points is better than misleading the reader, or in other words, or even worse, the reader will misinterpret what you've written because you wanted to avoid repetition so much that you chose a crazy synonym which didn't fit the context, or you chose some vocabulary which caused the reader to think in a slightly different way. So here, the contribution in this context is pretty well defined. We know what's going on. There's no point calling the second contribution anything else. You might confuse the reader, so just use contribution twice. So don't let repetition get in the way of clarity. So let's just close remove all of that. Now there is a different way to do this. If we here, I focused very much on the actions, the nouns, the activities that have to be done in the implementation, but we can focus in a slightly different way. So this is my first correction, but we could have a second correction in which I focused on making the list come alive. I've actually identified who is doing what, and that also makes it very easy to understand. So we know who is responsible for each action. So here, AA contributes BB's shares to CC. Okay, so we know what's going on. DD sells EE shares to FF. So we know what's going on. We know who is doing what. Here we have to use a passive form. We have to say GG is liquidated because in the original text it didn't tell us who was liquidating GG. It might not be that important in any case. II contributes HH's shares and JJ is transformed into KK. So here we've still got agreement. So the class or parallel phrasing box is ticked. The grammar is all of the same. It's still easy to read, and we've identified who is doing what. So we can have this agreement with class in a number of different ways. The key is to make sure that you have agreement, or as much as it's possible to have, that you have agreement. So here we can say, okay, I've got an active form here, active form here, active form here, active form here. Here we've got a passive, nothing we can do about that. But nevertheless, 4 out of 5 agree, so for today. The management board may be exempted from liability if they demonstrate that in an appropriate time a petition for bankruptcy was filed, or that composition proceedings were commenced, or that failure to apply for bankruptcy is not due to their fault, or that creditor did not suffer a loss despite the fact the petition for bankruptcy was not filed, or that or composition proceedings were not commenced. So it's once again a long sentences. We have got commas. Okay, so let's we've got commas in here. Let's just change the size here. So we got comma here, comma here, comma here, comma here. Where else have we got commas? Okay, so those are the commas. So there is some division in the sentence structure. It's not just one huge mess of words. Someone's using punctuation in order to break up the text in some way. The question then becomes, is the person using commas correctly to break up the text in the correct way? Because just throwing in commas everywhere is not a very good idea. In one of the other videos that I looked at, there were 2 very well-known cases, the $1 million case and the $10 million case. Both of those cases referred, or basically came down to the fact that there was a comma which was put in the wrong place, which meant that the message could be understood in one of 2 ways. One way would cost the company nothing. The other way would cost the company 1 million or 10 million, depending on the case. So just throwing in commas in an attempt to divide up the text is not a recommended solution. So that's one issue. The other issue, and I'll highlight this now, is that we've got or here, or here, or here. So we've got 3 ors, which are difficult to work with. So you've got this, or this, or this, or this. And when you're reading the text organized in this way, so in just one big block of text, this becomes quite difficult to work with. You've got to read it again, you've got to work out how everything relates to everything else. So we need to think about how to design this particular bit of text. The other point I wanted to raise in this, let's choose another question. Earlier on in the webinar, I talked about potentially confusing information, or that information can be understood in a different way. And the problem in this particular text is this modifier, which is in an appropriate time. In an appropriate time. Now here, it's placed in rather a lazy way. and in a lazy way that you don't know if it's part of the list or if it's not part of the list. And if it's part of the list, that means it's part of a point in the list, which means it doesn't apply to other points in the list. Let's see if I can make this a little bit clearer for you. So let's have a look at my redraft. Here it is here. The management board may be exempted from liability if they demonstrate in an appropriate time that, and then I've got here the 3 points which are important as far as I understand them. I might be wrong. Once again, I'm interpreting this text in the way that I think it makes sense. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm correct, but I hope I am. If you think I've got this wrong, then please let me know. But these are the 3 points which I think are being made. A petition for bankruptcy was filed, or that composition proceedings were started. So even though we've gone or in this place, let's go back to yellow. Even though we've got an or here, I still think that this is 1 point. I might be wrong, but this is what I think. Similarly, in this point here, the creditor did not suffer a loss despite the fact the petition for bankruptcy was not filed or composition proceedings were not started. I still think that this is 1 point, and that the list is controlled, or you are directed. Let's say it that way, by this or here, which means that you've got to choose one of these 3 options in order to qualify. In other words, be exempted from liability. This is how I understand it. So ors can cause confusion as regards what elements and how are they related. But going back to the confusing element of this, and that is this bit here. Let's go and change my pen size. In an appropriate time. Now, I'm going to make the assumption that all of these 3 points have got to be done in an appropriate time. That seems to make sense to me. It seems to be a common sense solution. However, my redrafting of this original text might be incorrect. It might be that this in an appropriate time might only apply to this first point. Because if we have a look at this, let's just quickly get rid of these commas as well. It might be the case that we could read the text like this. The management board may be exempted from liability if they demonstrate that, and if we might start our list here. So I'll draw in a colon here. In an appropriate time, a petition bankruptcy was filed, or that composition proceedings were commenced. So it might be the case that this modifier only applies to this text that follows. That part there, which of course changes the meaning of the whole text. So we've got to be particularly careful with modifiers and how we use modifiers. And one way that we can check to see if we are causing confusion, potentially causing confusion, is by using tabulation. Because when you tabulate something, you're forced to think about how everything relates to everything else. So when you create a tabulated list, you're actually thinking again about how you are communicating your message and which points are individual points and how those are organized within your tabulated list. So if we do that, it might cause you to think, aha, okay, this is what I actually meant, and so I've got to redraft my list in that way. If you remember my video, I talk a little bit about if charts, and I talk about tables and communicating information in tables or in if charts. And these also force you to think about how your message is created and how to break that message down. So I would strongly recommend that you go watch the video, or you use tables or if charts in your writing, because it causes you to think, how to break a message down, and how and what's the easiest way to understand your message. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of ground in the quite a lot of issues in the 3 examples that we looked at today. I wanted to focus on the tabulating side of things because tabulating is a wonderful aspect of document design. It clearly separates information from the rest of the text. It makes it a lot easier to find, and it's very, very reader friendly. So you might have had the experience, for example, if you've picked up a document from the government, if your government or local councils have well-designed documents, then very often you see the heading, and then you see text, and then you see the table, and very often you go straight to the table or the tabulated list, and you just start having a look at the tabulated list. You instantly know where you're going to find the information, and so tabulated lists or tables allow you to find that information very, very quickly. So strongly recommend lots of tabulation in your list, in your writing. Remember to use punctuation carefully. So use colons to indicate the start of a list. So when I see a colon in a text, I know that a list will follow. So punctuation is important. Correct punctuation. Don't just sling in or throw in lots and lots of commas because you feel you need to. It might lead to further problems down the line. Okay, if you've got any questions at all about what I've covered in today's webinar, if you agree or disagree with me or want to get in touch, please do so. This webinar or an edited version of this webinar will be available on my YouTube channel later on today, so if you want to comment on that, then please do. Or you can contact me through my website, writtenlegalenglish.com. That's my website there. You can contact me through writtenlegalenglish.com. There's a contact form there with any questions or queries that you might have, and I'll happily get back in contact with you and help you understand or explain any queries that you have. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Enjoy the rest of your days, and I'll see you again soon.